The rain over Seoul didn't wash the city clean. It only made the neon lights bleed into the asphalt, turning the streets into a slick, shimmering mirror of the chaos below. High above it all, on the 45th floor of the Skylark Tower, the air was usually perfectly filtered, smelling of expensive leather and cold ambition. Jun-ho stepped out of the private elevator, his knuckles white as he gripped his briefcase. He wasn't supposed to be here. The meeting in Incheon had been a setup, a waste of time designed to keep him away until midnight. But Jun-ho hadn't survived 10 years at the throat of the underworld by following schedules set by others. He had returned early, expecting the silence of an empty kingdom. Instead, he found the front door of his penthouse unlatched, just a fraction of an inch, enough to slide a credit card through, or a knife. He didn't draw his weapon immediately. To draw a gun was to admit fear, and Jun-ho did not fear his own home. He pushed the door open with a single, deliberate finger. The living room was bathed in the low, ambient glow of the city grid outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The shadows stretched long across the Italian marble floors, creating hiding spots in the corners of the room where the minimalist furniture offered no cover. He took a step, his shoes making no sound on the stone. He was a ghost in his own life, a man who had traded intimacy for security, and now, it seemed, he had neither. He moved toward the center of the room, his eyes scanning the mezzanine, calculating angles of attack. That was when he saw her. She was on her knees near the grand piano, a figure in a dark blue uniform that merged with the gloom. Imani. He knew her name only because it was on the payroll list his accountant sent him monthly, a 23-year-old from Kenya who cleaned the penthouse on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But today was Wednesday. She wasn't scrubbing the floor. She was frozen, a rag clutched in her hand, her eyes wide and fixed not on him, but on the hallway leading to the master bedroom. Jun-ho opened his mouth to demand an explanation, to assert the dominance that came as naturally to him as breathing, but she moved before he could speak. It wasn't a flinch of terror, it was a tactical intercept. Imani scrambled up from the floor, moving with a silent, terrifying grace that didn't fit the profile of a domestic worker. She closed the distance between them in 3 strides, her hand raising not to strike, but to silence. She pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that stopped his heart for a beat. "Stay silent," she whispered, the command barely more than an exhale. The authority in her voice was jarring. It wasn't a plea. It was an order. Before Jun-ho could recoil from the breach of protocol, she grabbed his lapel, pulling him down and sideways, forcing him behind the heavy velvet drapes just as the bedroom door clicked open. The sound was distinct, the oiled slide of a high-caliber pistol being racked. Jun-ho stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the holster beneath his jacket, but Imani's hand clamped over his wrist. Her grip was iron, shocking him. She shook her head, a microscopic movement, and pointed toward the reflection in the glass of the window. Through the gap in the curtains, Jun-ho saw the reflection of the living room behind them. A man stepped out of the bedroom, followed by a woman in a red dress.
Jun-ho's Brett hitched.
It was So Young, his fiancée, the woman who had sworn loyalty to him over a bottle of vintage wine 3 nights ago. And the man beside her was Director Kong, his second-in-command, the man who controlled the port logistics. They weren't just talking. They were hunting. "He's not answering his phone," Kong said, his voice carrying effortlessly in the acoustic perfection of the room. "If he's not back by midnight, we trigger the accounts anyway," So Young laughed, a sound that chilled Jun-ho more than the rain outside. "Don't worry. The brake line on his Phantom was cut an hour ago. If he's driving, he's already dead. We just need to find the ledger in the safe." Jun-ho felt the cold realization wash over him. He was a dead man walking, standing in his own funeral parlor, and the only thing between him and a bullet was the maid he had never looked in the eye. Imani didn't tremble. In the tight confinement behind the drapes, the scent of lavender detergent and rain clung to her. She was analyzing the room, her eyes darting from the reflection to the exits, counting the seconds. She leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear. "They have 2 more men in the kitchen," she breathed, her accent thick but precise. "The service elevator is locked from the outside. If we stay here, they will see your shoes." She was right. The tips of his Oxfords were peeking out from the hem of the curtain. Jun-ho pulled his feet back, feeling a sudden, strange shift in gravity. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the shark. He was the bait. And this woman, this stranger in a blue dress, was the only one who knew how to navigate the waters. The betrayal sat heavy in Jun-ho's gut, a stone of ice that made his movements stiff. He watched through the slit in the fabric as So-young poured herself a drink from his crystal decanter, the same one he had received as a gift from the triads. She moved with the arrogant comfort of a usurper, sliding her hand along the back of the sofa where they had sat just yesterday planning their wedding. "Check the study," she commanded Kong. "Tear the walls down if you have to." "I want those codes," Kong nodded, signaling toward the kitchen, and 2 large men in tactical gear emerged, moving with professional efficiency toward the hallway. They were professionals, mercenaries Jun-ho recognized from the erratic conflicts in the southern districts. "We have 2 minutes before they sweep this room," Imani whispered, her voice a vibration against his chest. She wasn't asking for his input. She was stating the tactical reality. Jun-ho looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. The uniform was practical, the fabric durable, but her stance was wrong for a maid. Her weight was balanced on the balls of her feet, her breathing controlled and rhythmic. "Who are you?" Jun-ho hissed, the question involuntary. "The person keeping you alive," she replied flatly. "Now listen. The main vents are too small for you. The balcony is a suicide drop. But the laundry chute in the utility closet has a maintenance bypass. It leads to the linen room on floor 40-inch.
Jun-ho frowned.
The utility closet is across the open floor. He gestured toward the expanse of marble that was now a kill zone. "They'll see us before we take 3 steps. Imani reached into the deep pocket of her dress and pulled out something that shouldn't have been there. A heavy, polished ball bearing, likely taken from a piece of decorative art, and a small aerosol can of lemon polish. "Distraction," she said. "When I roll this, they will look at the foyer. You move low behind the sofa. I follow. Do not hesitate." The command grated on him, his pride flaring even in the face of death. But the sight of So-young laughing as she held his life in her hands stamped out the ego. He nodded once. Imani waited, her timing impeccable. She watched Kong disappear into the study, then waited for the mercenaries to turn a corner. With a flick of her wrist, she sent the steel ball bearing skittering across the marble toward the front door. It clattered loudly against the metal threshold, sounding like a bolt being thrown. So-young spun around, dropping her glass. "Who's there?" she screamed, reaching into her purse for a weapon. The distraction was perfect. Jun-ho surged forward, keeping his body low to the ground, moving with explosive power he usually reserved for the boxing ring. He slid behind the long, white leather sofa just as So-young fired a shot blindly toward the door. The vase near the entrance shattered, showering the foyer in ceramic shrapnel. Imani was right behind him, her movement silent, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. They huddled behind the sofa, the smell of gunpowder now mixing with the expensive cologne and cleaning supplies. "Go," she signaled with her hand, pointing toward the utility door 10 feet away. It was a gamble. If So-young looked over the back of the sofa, it was over. But the panic had set in. So-young was yelling for Kong, her composure cracking. Jun-ho appreciated the irony. She wanted his empire, but she lacked his nerve. He moved again, a quick dash across the open space, his hand finding the handle of the utility closet. He twisted it, pulled, and they spilled inside into the darkness of the small room, the sound of shouting rising outside just as the latch clicked shut. Inside the closet, the darkness was absolute until Imani clicked on a small pen light, she held between her teeth. The space was cramped, filled with buckets, mops, and the metallic smell of bleach. Junho pressed his back against the shelving unit, his heart hammering a rhythm against his ribs that he hadn't felt since his early days on the streets of Busan. "They know we're here now," he said, his voice low and dangerous. They heard the door. Imani ignored him, her hands moving rapidly over the wall paneling near the floor. "They think it's an intruder, not you. They don't know the tiger is home," she corrected, prying a panel loose with the edge of a multi-tool she produced from her belt. "Why are you helping me?" Junho asked, watching her work. "You could have walked away. You could have sold me out." The question hung in the stale air. Imani paused for a second, the blue light of the torch illuminating the sharp angles of her face. "Because I don't like dirt," she said, her tone unreadable. "And betrayers leave the worst kind of stains." She pulled the panel free, revealing a dark, square chute that smelled of damp fabric and old dust. "This is the bypass. It's tight. You go first. Use your legs to brake against the sides. If you fall straight down, you break your neck." She looked up at him, her eyes challenging his hesitation. "Unless the great Junho is afraid of a little dust." He stared at her, a smirk touching the corner of his mouth despite the adrenaline. "I built this tower," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "I know its bones." He didn't, not really. He knew the blueprints, the cost, the prestige. He didn't know the guts of the building like she did. He realized then that he had been living on the surface of his own world, while she had been navigating the depths. He slid into the chute, the metal cold against his suit trousers. It was humiliating, undignified, and absolutely necessary. He braced his legs against the narrow walls, looking up at her one last time. "If we survive this," he said, "I'm doubling your salary." Imani didn't smile. She just checked the door behind them as the handle began to rattle violently. "Let's survive first," she said, and dropped in after him, pulling the panel back into place just as the wood of the door splintered under a kick. The slide was a nightmare of friction and claustrophobia. Junho descended in jerks and starts, his expensive Italian loafers scraping against the galvanized steel. Above him, he could hear the soft scuffing of Imani's sneakers, her descent controlled and rhythmic. They were sliding down the throat of the beast, leaving the luxury of the penthouse for the industrial underbelly of the tower. He counted the floors in his head, 44, 43, 42. The air grew warmer, thicker. Finally, his feet hit a pile of canvas laundry bags with a heavy thud. He rolled out, coughing in the lint-filled air of the linen room on the 40th floor. He stood up, brushing the gray dust from his suit jacket, trying to regain some semblance of the boss he was 10 minutes ago. Imani landed lightly beside him, barely disturbing the dust. She immediately moved to the door, pressing her ear against it. "Security patrol passes every 15 minutes, she whispered. "We have 6 minutes." Junho looked around. They were in a staging area for the hotel staff, rows of fresh towels, carts of toiletries, uniforms hanging in plastic bags. It was a world of service, invisible to the guests, invisible to him. "We need a weapon," Junho said, scanning the shelves. "I can't fight Kang's mercenaries with a bottle of shampoo." "You don't fight them," Imani said, walking over to a maintenance locker. "You outthink them." She opened the locker and tossed him a heavy, industrial-grade steam wand, attached to a portable tank. "High pressure. Burn skin on contact." Better than a knife in a hallway, she grabbed a set of master keys from a hook inside the locker. Keys that definitely shouldn't have been left there. Junho raised an eyebrow. "You know a lot about this building's security lapses," he noted. "I observe," she replied simply, slinging a coil of heavy extension cord over her shoulder. "People like you look at the view. People like me look at the cracks." She moved to the door, checking the peephole.
Clear.
"We need to get to the freight elevators on 30. The passenger elevators are rigged with biometric scanners that Kong controls now. But the freight is manual override." Junho nodded, the weight of the steam tank heavy in his hand. It felt crude, ridiculous, and strangely empowering. He was the master of the city, armed with cleaning equipment, following a maid into a war zone. "Lead the way," he said. As she opened the door, a sudden noise froze them both, the ding of the service elevator down the hall. The door slid open, and two men stepped out. They weren't hotel security. They wore the distinct, tactical black of Kang's private cleanup crew. They held submachine guns tight to their chests, scanning the corridor. They were between Jun-ho and the exit. Imani pulled him back into the shadows of the doorframe. "Too late," she whispered. Their sweeping floor by floor, Jun-ho felt a surge of cold rage. They were boxing him in. "I can take two," he whispered back, calculating the distance. "No," she grabbed his arm. "Not with noise. If you shoot, 10 more come." "We have to go through the service ceiling," she pointed up. The drop ceiling tiles. It was insane. It was desperate. It was his only shot. The crawl space above the ceiling tiles was a suffocating grid of ducts and wires. Jun-ho dragged himself forward on his elbows, the sharp metal of the suspension grid digging into his forearms. Below them, through the gaps in the tiles, he could see the tops of the mercenaries' heads as they moved down the corridor, checking rooms. The dust up here was thick, ancient. He tried to control his breathing, every inhalation a struggle against the urge to cough. Imani was ahead of him, moving with the eerie silence of a predator. She knew exactly where to place her weight, avoiding the weak points that would send them crashing down into the line of fire. "Wait," she signaled, her hand flashing in the gloom. They stopped directly above a junction where the two mercenaries had paused to talk. "Kong says kill on sight." One voice drifted up. "No questions." "And the girl?" "The maid." The other man laughed. "Collateral. Dispose of her." No witnesses. Jun-ho felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. They talked about her like she was debris. He looked at Imani's silhouette. She hadn't flinched. If anything, she seemed to harden, her posture radiating a cold, lethal focus. She wasn't just a survivor. She was angry. And Jun-ho realized with a start that he preferred her anger to her fear. They reached a section where a large bundle of heavy cables ran down a vertical shaft. "This feeds the server room on 38, Imani whispered. "We slide, it wasn't a question." She wrapped her uniform skirt around her legs, grabbed the thick, rubber-coated cables, and dropped into the darkness. Jun-ho followed, the friction burning his palms, his expensive suit tearing at the seams. They landed hard on the metal grating of the server room floor, the hum of cooling fans drowning out the sound of their arrival. The room was bathed in blinking green and red lights, a digital heartbeat. "My access codes," Jun-ho said, looking at the main terminal. "I can lock them out. I can freeze the accounts from here." He moved toward the console, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was his domain. Information. Control. He typed in his master sequence, expecting the familiar welcome screen. Instead, a red skull flashed on the monitor. "Access denied. System override by user, Kong." Jun-ho slammed his fist onto the desk. "He's already locked me out. He's been planning this for months." He turned to Imani, desperation creeping into his eyes. "I have nothing. No money, no comms, no control." Imani walked over to him, her face illuminated by the red warning light. She didn't offer pity. She offered a plan. "You have your life," she said, pulling a prepaid burner phone from her bra. "And you have the one thing they didn't account for." She tapped the phone. "This building has a blind spot. The old analog intercom system in the basement parking. It's not connected to the network. If we get there, we can call out. We can call your allies." Jun-ho stared at the cheap plastic phone.
It was a lifeline.
"Who do we call?" he asked. "The police are in Kang's pocket." Imani looked at him, her eyes dark and serious. "We don't call the police. We call the only people who hate Kong more than you do. The Busan Syndicate." The journey to the basement was a blur of service stares and close calls. By the time they reached the B4 level, Junho was drenched in sweat and grime, his knuckles bloody from prying open a jammed fire door. The air here was heavy with exhaust fumes and damp concrete. They moved through the shadows of the parked cars, luxury vehicles sitting silent in their stalls. Junho spotted his phantom, the one So Young had mentioned. He saw the puddle of fluid beneath it. Brake fluid. She hadn't been lying. They had tried to kill him before he even walked in the door. The intercom is in the security booth by the south ramp, Imani whispered. But there's a problem, she pointed. The booth was lit up. Inside, a guard was watching a bank of monitors. And standing outside the booth, leaning against a pillar, was a man Junho recognized. It wasn't a mercenary. It was his personal driver, the man who had driven him for 5 years. Another betrayal. The knife twisted deeper. He has the key card for the gate, Junho said. We needed to get out. Imani looked at the steam wand Junho was still carrying, then at the fire alarm pull station on the wall near them. Fire and water, she muttered. I created a version. You take the key. Before Junho could argue, she moved. She didn't go for the alarm. She went for a pile of oily rags near a maintenance bin. She struck a match from a book she had picked up in the living room. The irony of it being a matchbook from his own hotel wasn't lost on him, and dropped it. The rags flared up instantly. She triggered the sprinklers with the heat of the fire, but only in that sector. Chaos erupted. The sprinklers hissed to life, spraying dirty water over the expensive cars. The driver shouted, pushing off the pillar, distracted by the sudden localized deluge. The guard inside the booth stood up, confused. That was Junho's window. He sprinted through the shadows, the water masking his footsteps. He tackled the driver from behind, the impact sending them both skidding across the wet concrete. The driver was strong, but Junho was fighting for his existence. He delivered a short, brutal elbow to the man's temple, knocking him unconscious. He ripped the key card from the driver's belt. He looked up to see Imani holding the door of the security booth shut, trapping the guard inside. The guard was pounding on the glass, shouting into his radio. We have to go, she yelled, pointing to a nondescript gray sedan parked in the corner, a staff car. The gate. Now. Junho scrambled into the driver's seat of the sedan, the engine roaring to life as he hotwired it with a push-button override he knew all fleet cars had. Imani dove into the passenger seat just as the elevator doors across the garage burst open. Calm was there. He wasn't smiling anymore. He raised a submachine gun and opened fire. The windshield shattered as Junho floored the accelerator. He swerved toward the ramp, the tires screaming on the wet concrete. Bullets sparked against the rear bumper. He swiped the key card at the sensor, praying the system hadn't been purged. The light turned green. The heavy steel gate began to rise, agonizingly slow. Faster. Imani screamed, grabbing the wheel to correct their slide. Junho didn't wait for the gate to fully open. He rammed the top of the sedan through the gap, metal shrieking against metal, the roof buckling, sparks showering them like fireworks. They burst out onto the rainy street, the sedan fishtailing violently before gripping the asphalt. Junho looked in the rearview mirror. The gate was closing again. They were out. But as he looked at Imani, removing shards of glass from her hair, he knew the real war had just begun. She looked back at him, breathless, terrified, and alive. Where to? She asked. Junho gripped the wheel, his eyes cold. To the only place they won't look. You're home. The drive to the outskirts of Seoul was a blur of neon streaks and lashing rain, the stolen sedan vibrating with the strain of an engine pushed beyond its limits. Junho drove with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed against his ribs, where a bruise was blooming into a deep, angry purple. Beside him, Imani was no longer the servant in the background. She was the navigator, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror with a vigilance that matched his own. They abandoned the car 3 blocks from her apartment, wiping the steering wheel and door handles in the pouring rain before disappearing into the labyrinth of narrow alleyways that define the older, poorer district of the city. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a walk-up that smelled of damp concrete and frying garlic, a stark cry from the filtered air of the Skylark Tower. When she unlocked the door and ushered him inside, the silence of the small room felt heavier than the noise of the chase. It was a tiny space, cluttered with books and mismatched furniture, but it was warm, and for the first time in 4 hours, they were invisible. Junho collapsed onto the edge of her narrow bed, the adrenaline finally draining out of him, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion and the sharp sting of the glass cuts on his cheek. Imani didn't rest. She moved through the small space with efficiency, pulling the curtains tight and wedging a chair under the doorknob. She disappeared into the tiny bathroom and returned with a basin of warm water and a clean towel. "Sit still," she commanded, wringing out the cloth. Junho looked up at her. In the harsh light of the single overhead bulb, stripped of the shadows of the penthouse, she was breathtaking in a way he hadn't let himself notice before. The rain had plastered her hair to her skin, and the adrenaline had flushed her cheeks. She stepped between his spread knees, invading his personal space with a clinical detachment that maddened him. As she dabbed the wet cloth against the cut on his temple, the sting made him hiss, but he didn't pull away. Her hands were gentle, contrasting with the iron grip she had used to drag him to safety. "Why?" he asked again, his voice rough. "You risk your life for a boss who didn't know your last name until today." Imani paused, her hand resting on his shoulder to steady him. Her dark eyes searched his, and for a moment, the barrier of class and status evaporated completely. "Power is lonely, Junho," she said softly, using his name without the honorifics for the first time. "I watched you for 2 years. You treat the staff like ghosts, yes. But you never treated us like trash. And I saw how they looked at you, so young and calm. They looked at you like a meal." The intimacy of the moment was suffocating and electric. Junho reached up, his hand catching her wrist. Her pulse was hammering against his fingertips, a frantic rhythm that betrayed her calm exterior. "I am not a good man, Imani," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her inner wrist. "I have done things that would make you run if you knew the half of it." She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in closer, the scent of rain and cheap soap filling his senses. "I know what you are," she whispered, her gaze dropping to his lips before snapping back to his eyes. "You are a wolf. But tonight, you are a wolf with a broken leg. And I am the only one who knows how to set the bone." She pulled back slowly, the loss of her warmth hitting him like a physical blow. She turned to a small kitchenette, her back to him, but the tension in her shoulders was visible. "Take off your shirt," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to wrap your ribs." As he unbuttoned his ruined dress shirt, revealing the map of scars across his torso, he realized that she wasn't just saving his life, she was rewriting it. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. In this room, she was the queen, and he was the refugee, and the terrifying part was how much he wanted to surrender to her. The morning light that filtered through Imani's thin curtains was gray and weak, but it was enough to illuminate the war room she had created on her small dining table. Junho sat shirtless, his ribs bound tightly in bandages, watching her lay out the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized she was solving. It wasn't just cleaning supplies she carried in her cart. It was a mind sharper than any lieutenant he had ever employed. On the table were scraps of paper, receipts, notes, doodles that formed a timeline of Kang's schedule. "Khan isn't just taking over the port," Imani explained, pointing to a series of dates. "He's selling it. He has a meeting tonight at the Incheon container terminal with the Russian buyers. That's why he needed you dead yesterday. He needs your biometric key to open the shipping manifest." Junho leaned forward, the pain in his side a dull throb that kept him focused. "He can't open the manifest without my retina scan," he said. Unless he stopped, the realization chilling his blood. Unless he has a copy, Imani nodded grimly. The medical exam you took last month. The doctor was on So-young's payroll. I heard her on the phone in the hallway. Junho slammed his hand on the table, rattling the coffee mugs. They have everything, he growled. My money, my tower, my codes. I have nothing to bargain with, he stood up, pacing the small room like a caged animal. I have to kill them. I have to go to the terminal and burn it down. Imani stood up and blocked his path. She was a foot shorter than him, but she held her ground with a ferocity that stopped him cold. If you go there with guns, you die, she said, her voice hard. You are one man against an army. You need leverage, not bullets. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, unassuming USB drive. I didn't just listen, Junho. I recorded. He stared at the drive. What is on there? She stepped closer, her hand resting on his bare chest, her touch burning his skin. So-young and Kong planning the sale. Admitting they are cutting out the Busan syndicate. Admitting they are stealing from the Russians to pay their debts. A slow, predatory smile spread across Junho's face. It was the smile that had made him the king of Seoul, but now it was tempered with a new respect for the woman standing before him. If the Russians hear this, he said, they will skin Kong alive, Imani nodded. And if the Busan syndicate hears it, they will burn Skylark Tower to the ground to get to So-young. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce. We don't need to fight them. We just need to deliver the message. Junho looked at her, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion that felt dangerously like love. He reached out, cupping her face in his rough hands. You are dangerous, he whispered, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. More dangerous than me. Imani leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a second. I had to be, she breathed. To survive in your world, he lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. When we take it back, he promised, his voice low and intense, you will never have to be invisible again. The promise hung in the air, heavy and binding, a vow made in the quiet before the storm. The Incheon container terminal was a sprawling city of steel and rust, a maze of shipping containers stacked 5 high, creating canyons of shadows under the harsh industrial floodlights. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with salt and diesel. Junho and Imani moved through the periphery, dressed in dark workers' coveralls they had stolen from a laundry truck an hour ago. Junho felt the weight of a pistol tucked into his waistband, a piece he had retrieved from a hidden cache in his old neighborhood, but he knew Imani was right. The weapon was a last resort. The real weapon was the USB drive taped to his chest. They crouched behind a stack of blue containers, watching the main loading dock where a convoy of black SUVs was parked. Kong was there, looking triumphant in a trench coat, shaking hands with a massive man who could only be the Russian buyer. So-young stood nearby, holding a tablet, likely ready to initiate the transfer. The server node is in the control tower, Imani whispered, pointing to a glass structure overlooking the yard. If we plug the drive in there, we can broadcast the audio over the entire yard's PA system. Every worker, every guard, and the Russians will hear it. It was a bold, theatrical plan, exactly the kind of move Junho loved. The tower is guarded, Junho noted, spotting 2 men at the base of the stairs. I'll draw them off, he said, preparing to move. Imani grabbed his arm.
No.
You need to get to the tower. I will draw them off. Before he could argue, she slipped away into the shadows. Junho watched her go, his heart hammering against his ribs. It went against every instinct. He had to let her expose herself to danger, but he had to trust her. He had to trust the partner he had found in the wreckage of his life. Minutes later, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the yard, the sound of a forklift tipping over, followed by the screech of metal. The guards at the tower shouted and ran toward the noise. Stay silent, Junho whispered to himself, echoing her command, and sprinted across the open ground. He hit the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, his movements fueled by a desperate need to end this, so he could get back to her. He reached the control room, kicked the door open, and subdued the lone technician inside with a sleeper hold before the man could reach for the alarm. He scanned the console, finding the input port. His hands were shaking slightly as he inserted the drive. He punched the commands to override the audio feed. Below him, in the yard, the transaction was concluding. Kong was laughing. Junho keyed the microphone, his voice booming out over the massive speakers, echoing off the steel canyons. "Good evening, Director Kong," he said, his voice cold and magnified. "I believe you forgot to mention the surcharge." The effect was instantaneous. In the yard below, every head snapped up toward the tower. Kong froze, his face draining of color even at this distance. So-young dropped the tablet. Junho hit play. The recording blasted through the night air. So-young's voice, clear and undeniable, mocking the Russian buyer's intelligence, detailing exactly how they were skimming 20% off the top and how they planned to frame the Busan syndicate for the theft. The Russian buyer stopped moving. He turned slowly to Kong, who was now frantically waving his hands, trying to explain, trying to shout over his own treacherous voice booming from the sky. The mercenaries Kong had hired looked at each other, confused, their loyalty wavering in the face of such a public disaster. But Junho wasn't done. He saw movement in the shadows near the containers, Imani sprinting back toward the tower. But she was cut off. So-young, realizing the game was up, had spotted her. "Get her." So-young screamed, pointing a finger. "She's the one." 3 of Kang's men turned, raising their weapons. Junho didn't think. He didn't strategize. He grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit on the wall, shattered the window of the control tower with a chair, and leaned out. He aimed not at the men, but at a cluster of fuel drums near them. He fired. The flare arced through the night, a streak of burning red, and struck the drum. The explosion was deafening, a ball of fire erupting that knocked the mercenaries off their feet and sent a shockwave rattling through the yard. "Imani!" Junho roared, abandoning the tower. He slid down the ladder, hitting the ground running. The yard had turned into chaos. The Russians were shooting at Kang's men. Kong was trying to flee to his car. But Junho only had eyes for the figure in the blue coveralls scrambling away from the flames. He reached her just as she stumbled, pulling her up and shielding her body with his own as bullets pinged off the metal container behind them. He spun around, firing his pistol with precise, controlled shots, dropping the mercenary closest to them. "We have to move," he yelled, grabbing her hand. But she wasn't looking at the exit. She was looking at So-young, who was standing alone amidst the carnage, her red dress ruined, holding a gun with shaking hands. Junho leveled his weapon at his former fiancée. The air between them crackled with a ghost of their past, but Junho felt nothing but the warmth of the woman beside him. "It's over, So-young," he said, his voice flat. So-young looked at him, then at Imani and laughed, a broken, hysterical sound. "You chose the help," she sneered. Junho didn't blink. "I chose the queen," he said, and fired a single shot into the ground at her feet.
Run.
"Before the Russians get to you." 3 hours later, the silence of the night had returned, but it was a different kind of silence. They sat on the hood of the stolen sedan, parked on a hill overlooking the city. The distant wail of sirens from the port was a reminder of the fire they had started, but up here, the air was cool and clean. Junho had regained his kingdom, or what was left of it. The Busan syndicate had already reached out, offering a truce in exchange for the territory Kong had lost. The Russians had taken care of Kong. So-young was in the wind, a ghost with no name and no money. Junho looked at his hands, still stained with grease and gunpowder, then looked at Imani. She was staring at the lights of the Skylark Tower in the distance. "You can have it back," she said softly, not looking at him. "The penthouse. The money. It's all yours again." Junho slid off the hood and stood in front of her, forcing her to look at him. "It's just a building," he said. It was cold. It was empty. He reached out, taking her hands in his. They were rough, calloused, the hands of a worker, the hands of a fighter. He brought them to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence he had never shown a diamond ring. I don't want to go back there alone. I don't want to be the king if it means sleeping with one eye open. He looked deep into her eyes, searching for the answer to the question he hadn't asked yet. Stay with me, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Not as my maid, not as my guard, as my partner. Imani looked at him, tears shimmering in her eyes, reflecting the city lights. She pulled her hands free, but only to wrap her arms around his neck, pulling him down to her level. You are high maintenance, Junho, she whispered, a small, teasing smile playing on her lips. And your apartment is a mess, Junho laughed, a genuine, deep sound that felt foreign in his chest. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off the hood, crushing her against him. Then tell me what to do, he murmured against her lips. Tell me to stay silent. Tell me to run. I'll do whatever you say, she shook her head, her forehead resting against his. No more orders, she whispered, before closing the distance between them. The kiss was desperate and sweet, tasting of rain and survival. It wasn't the kiss of a fairy tale. It was the seal of a pact between two people who had seen the darkness and chosen to face it together. As they pulled apart, breathless, Imani looked back at the city. First, she said, her voice strong and clear, we get better security. And then, she smiled, we get some food. I'm starving, Junho smiled back, the dangerous Mafia boss gone, replaced by a man who had finally found his home. Yes, ma'am, he said, and opened the car door for her.